Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent with me, Gbenga Aborowa. This is where we bring you all the security updates across the continent. But before we delve into today's discussion, here are the major security headlines across the continent. Guinea-Bissau investigates failed coup that killed more than 6 people at the presidential palace. Germany is looking to end military operations in Mali, and the Nigerian government says it has uncovered 96 financiers of terrorism. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls for cessation of hostilities in Ethiopia. And at least 60 people have been killed in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo's Ituri province. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Now, today on Secure the Continent, our focus will be on the violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. More than 100 armed groups, such as the Ugandan Allied Democratic Forces, are believed to be operating in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Despite the presence of more than 16,000 United Nations peacekeepers, these groups continue to terrorize communities and control weakly governed areas. And just yesterday, at least 60 people were killed in a militia attack at a displaced persons camp in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. We'll bring you more details in this report.
The Democratic Republic of Congo has struggled to find its footing after dictator Mobutu Sese Seko was overthrown. Ever since then, peace has been an elusive challenge for the vast nation. For more than 2 decades, the eastern provinces of sub-Saharan Africa's largest country by area, the Democratic Republic of Congo, have been a hotbed of violence. Politically, historically, and economically significant to the continent, the DRC sits at the heart of Central Africa, surrounded by a wealth of riches. The Republic of Congo is a country rich in copper, gold, diamonds, cobalt, uranium, coltan, and oil. By all accounts, the Republic of Congo should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But that wealth for the citizens, like peace, has remained elusive. The tension in the eastern part of the country has left cracks open, snowballing from a politically mediated regional war to a full-blown insurgency, and helping the recruitment of terrorists by foreign organizations. Congo's instability is not limited to its past and present political struggles, as it also suffers from a deep ethnic division fueled by the tussle for equity in sharing the proceeds of globally sought-after resources. Rebel groups sit close to these resources, driving conflicts and using the proceeds of their violent campaigns to fund their own insurgencies and recruit more unemployed youth into their ranks. Thousands of lives have been lost in the subsequent humanitarian catastrophe. There are many who have only known wars, bloodshed, and the sound of gunshots. Peace, stability, and development of its natural resources to the benefit of its citizens will change not only the DRC's fortunes, but the fortunes of the region. After decades of instability, has the time for peace and progress finally come?
Now, joining me today on Secure the Continent is Peer Shouten, a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies and an expert on the conflict in the Congo, who has just released the book Roadblock Politics, The Origins of Violence in Central Africa. And I also have joining me live from Melbourne, Australia, Jordy Umbalo, who's a counterterrorism expert. Gentlemen, welcome to Secure the Continent.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
Now, I'd like to start with Jordy. The Democratic Republic of Congo is slowly recovering from a conflict known as Africa's First World War, which led to the loss of some 5 million lives. which led to the loss of some 5 million lives between 1994 and 2003. But many eastern areas are still plagued by violence as various rebel groups continue to operate there. What has the fighting been all about?
These fights has been mostly led by militias created during 1998 to 2004. And then these are often militias fighting because they want to control resources in North Kivu or in Ituri provinces, or also to control territories. And fighting sometimes is also crossover between the army and foreign armies like the Rwandans and Ugandans controlling militias just so they could continue exploitations of the Eastern Congo's resources. And also sometimes it also because of the lack of governance in DRC itself, where the government often, tend to be, I would say, not enforcing the authority of the government by the fact that they are corrupt. Also, complacency, I would say. During, for example, Kabila's era, there was a lot of efforts made to end violence in the East. However, the army itself was plagued with high-ranking official that the United Nations has labeled as, using militias or and also exploiting resources and transporting into the neighboring countries like Rwanda and Uganda. And then they often rely on those militias for to exploit those resources and exploit controlling those rich areas in North Kivu, in Beni region, for example. And then recently, since 2014, there was another phenomenon which the government back in the days had labeled as terrorist with the Ugandan ADF, which the government had labeled as a terrorist organizations linked to ISIS, Islamic State. However, no evidence has been brought forward to link that to Islamic State. However, this group have been committing crimes against humanity in Beni region, and then recently have expanded in Ituri. And Ituri itself is plagued with not just the ADF, but also another militia called Codeco. And the Codeco is responsible of the killings that happened recently.
Just yesterday.
60 people, yesterday, 60 people killed in a refugee camp. And many reports come and say the army had been controlling that area to protect the refugees, the people that had fled conflict in that area, and yet been attacked by the Codeco.
Thank you, Jordy. I'd like to bring in Peer here. Jordy just painted a very complex situation of the fight for resources in the Eastern DRC. Now, a lot of people have painted it as the Wild Wild East. It's a very dark picture of the things that are happening there. It's said that more than 100 armed groups operate in the Eastern DRC. So my question to you, Peer, is this: who are the main actors in the Eastern DRC? Do they share the same philosophy or goals? And what do they want?
Thanks. That's a really good question. And I think in order to understand it, we have to go back to the 1990s when foreign-backed militias entered the DR Congo, first of all, to liberate Congo from and overthrow Mobutu. But quickly it turned out that some of these armed groups actually also abused the population and exploited its resources. So in response, a lot of communities created self-defense militias and to try to protect local communities against that so-called foreign invasion. So ever since, armed groups have really formed an essential part of the political economy of Eastern Congo, because over time, actually, armed mobilization turned into a goal itself, to make money, to express political power, or simply for youth to cope with the chaos. So the typical thing to happen is that the community feels threatened by the army's exploits or an armed group, and then youth start a self-defense group. To survive and acquire weapons, they start taxing traders or farmers. Yeah. Yes, and then this turns out lucrative, and before you know it, the group's leaders strike bargains with their enemies to divide the spoils. And then a faction might feel left out of the spoils or finds the leaders corrupted, and they start their own group in turn, fighting the first one. And this is happening all over Eastern Congo. Many of these initial groups, they mixed, they split, and metastasized into today's complex tapestry of rebels. By the latest count, indeed, I think there's over 130 different armed groups present in Eastern DRC. Now, many of these 130 armed groups are really small local factions, generally called Mai Mai. But of course, there's a few groups that really stand out for their geopolitical clout or role in the conflict. The ADF, about whom I'm sure we'll talk a bit more, is one of them. Another one is the FDLR, a small group of Rwandaphone Hutu rebels that can be traced all the way back to the Rwandese genocide. And then there's Codeco, a more or less ethnic militia in Ituri that engages in brutal massacres. Now, it's difficult to say what all these groups want, but in most cases it involves a mix of grievances, typically around land, local struggles for land, but also economic interests in taxing trade and mining. Over the course of my research, I have, for instance, mapped 800 roadblocks in just 2 provinces of Eastern Congo, where rebels and soldiers tax flows of aid, trade, and minerals. But one shouldn't forget the often invisible political elite figures who gain power in regional or national politics from manipulating these local armed groups. It is to be remembered that many government people and generals are former rebels themselves, who have been integrated into the army. So the connections are often quite close. You know, in Congo, people actually like to joke that the army is the country's biggest armed group. And in many ways, its units actually often behave just like rebels.
And that brings me to this question. You just painted a picture and the vicious cycle of what produces these armed groups. These sort of things only happen in the failed state. What's the central government in Kinshasa doing about this? And
Right.
Do they have any control whatsoever on the Eastern DRC and what's happening there?
Yes, that's a very good question. I mean, there's been a state of siege that the government has imposed, the Tshisekedi government in Eastern Congo, and I totally understand the idea. The president notices that his government is totally entangled with the conflict in the east, so he suspends it and calls the army in to clean up. Well, I've traveled in Ituri last November, just after the civilian administration had been replaced by the army, and I can say that the state of siege hasn't resolved much. President Tshisekedi has ordered the deployment of 3,000 troops to Ituri, but when he actually arrived there to inspect the troops, he found out that only 300 soldiers had been deployed, and that the rest of the money had been eaten up by his generals. And even after reinforcements came in, it turned out that the army is mostly fueling more insecurity, both because they engage in predatory behavior during the deployment, but also because armed groups turned more aggressive in response. Indeed, the attack just recently of the armed group called Codeco involved killing 50 people in an IDP camp, basically under the noses of the Congolese army.
Quite a terrible picture you just painted there, Pierre. Now, I would like to bring in Jordy. Last year, the United States Department of State designated, like Pierre rightly said, one of those groups that has geopolitical clout, the Ugandan Allied Democratic Forces and the DRC, as a terrorist organization. What is the effect of this designation, and does it change anything on the ground, really?
To be honest, this the fact that the State Department recognized these forces as a terrorist organization hasn't changed anything on the ground. Like Peter said, the government hasn't done enough to put an end to this insecurity in Eastern Congo. But just by the fact that, for example, the army has been deployed, however, no ammunition was followed, or no renewed strategies. These strategies has been put in place by the former government of Joseph Kabila, and a deployment of 21,000 troops to fight the ADF since 2014. However, there have been reports that high-ranking officials within the army has been cooperating with militias, with the ADF itself. And then once the army has been deployed, the population itself are caught in between the army and the ADF. And then often the population would tend to try to cooperate with the army. And then once they realize that on the ground, the army is more or less cooperating or having some kind of complacency in fighting the ADF in reality, it creates kind of like an insecurity, and the population is caught in between. And then therefore, the only way that the population can do is either to be displaced. And when the new regime came into place, Felix Tshisekedi, nothing has been done, in fact, to change what was done before. And again, there've been another redeployment and then put in place the state of siege or state of emergency with a military governor in North Kivu and Ituri. This was, in fact, in reality, to fight and end this violence. However, it's been, the Constitution says this can only be extended for a short period, but this has been going on for 6 months now. And then nothing has changed. No strategies has been put in place. And then the presence of the army has just made this violence even more violent. And then the population is still being caught in between. And then on the ground, the army has failed to change the situation. To me, the reason is that this ADF, it's a force that completely can disappear, dissolve in the community. They speak the language, they know the ground really well. And then the army, on the other hand, has deployed troops that have been there for over 10 years now. There's that fatigue within the army, within the troops. The troops are willing to fight. However, the top generals are caught in between dealing and doing deals with local militias and exploiting resources, owning land. It demoralizes the troops, and the capital, the people in the capital are completely complacent in the fact that they haven't put in place measures to stop or change the dynamic in the region, in the army itself.
Now, Jordy, sorry to butt in there. I want to take you up on what happened yesterday. This group called the Cooperative for the Development of Congo, CODECO, they masterminded the recent killings just yesterday and the displacement of over 1.5 million people. Not all the groups in the eastern DRC are fighting for spoils of war. This CODECO, I learned during the course of my research that there's some ethnic connotations to their operations. Who are they, and why would they attack a displacement camp? What type of message were they sending by doing that?
Well, there've been the connotation. There's been fighting between two or different ethnic groups. However, this has been resolved over time. At the moment, like yesterday, I was speaking to some of my people on the ground. People have said that it's actually, in fact, that the fact that at this point, the army has invited the Ugandan army to and to the militias, especially the ADF, the militias on the ground has sort of made this attack to make a point to the government, because when this camp was attacked, the army was around there, and then the army has more or less done nothing. And the Ugandan army has recently been deployed in North Kivu, but just last week, they have been deployed in Ituri province. So to me, this was a message sent to the government directly to say that, to show that they are still there and they can still hit where it hurts the most.
Okay, thank you, Jordy. Now, Pierre, we've heard about the lack of discipline among the Congolese army, where the generals are interested in just keeping the pockets fat. What's the government in Kinshasa doing about this and international development partners? Because it's obvious that the Congolese army is not fit for purpose. And elections are coming up next year, I believe, in the DRC. Is President Felix Tshisekedi not worried about not getting re-elected? Because the security situation in the eastern DRC, it's a big issue. It sticks out like a sore thumb.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, but I think in order to understand it, we need to backtrack a little and just discuss the ADF a little bit more. And I think there's another angle to that which is really important, which goes for the ADF as well as for Codeco to a certain extent. The funny thing with the ADF is that it is convenient for many people to have that group as a threat. As Jordy alluded to, in the past, Congo has supported the ADF to subvert Rwandan and Ugandan influence in the country. And still today, army networks are supplying them with ammo and intel. For criminal gangs, in turn, the presence of the ADF is really great because they can just dress up a bit like the ADF, and then the ADF will be blamed and not them. A bit like what happens with Boko Haram sometimes, right?
Yes.
Blaming a group hated by many people can
they're the boogeymen, yes.
Out of view, indeed. And for the Congolese army, the ADF has meant having a reason to be operational and deployed and thus gain important primes. And it's also a good pretext for deploying in an area with a lot of natural resources. So a UN source inside MONUSCO told me off the record that they felt like they were offering logistical support to the criminal activities of the army who were deployed in Beni. And for Uganda, the ADF threat forms a nice pretext to be involved in Congo, which is an important source of revenues due to all the tropical hardwood and gold that are exported and taxed in Uganda. I mean, the ADF is brutal and responsible for many civilian deaths in Eastern Congo. And I do applaud the joint efforts by the UPDF and the Congolese army and the significant progress in terms of capturing key ADF figures.
But the war is asymmetrical, and they just dissolve into civilian homes. And like you said earlier, they're almost like the locals, so it's hard to tell. What other approaches could they use in, taking care of ADF and diminishing the threat?
Right. I mean, the ADF has been in Congo since 1995, right? And because the group's existence is strategic for many, I think it's unlikely that the group will be weeded out completely anytime soon, just like the FDLR, which is very weak at the moment, but very difficult to completely eradicate, also because there is always at some point some kind of support from high-level figures, be it in neighboring countries, be it in Congo itself, for the group's sustenance. I think with the example of Codeco, we can talk a bit more about what could be done, because Codeco is an ethnically affiliated group to the Lendu population, and their militarization has really revolved around brutal attacks against villages of the Hema population. That is the other kind of majority group in part of Ituri. And that group has responded by starting another armed group, Zaire, that's called themselves Zaire. What you have now is a kind of militarization of ethnic relations again in Ituri, which was also the driver of some of the worst violence in the Second Congo War, which you might remember from the early 2000s. And at that point, what really worked was to bring together key civil society figures, church leaders that are respected by the communities, and work through key community stakeholders to try and address perhaps some of the underlying tensions and to create kind of relations of collaboration. The problem, though, is that as happens so often in Congo, these groups have now metastasized into something where economic interests also play a really big group. So they're really fighting over control over mineral sites and the taxation of mines. And when these economic interests kind of become entrenched, then it becomes more difficult to solve such kind of conflicts.
Now, Per, you just painted a picture of the Eastern DRC. It's a fertile ground there. All the conditions are there to keep proliferation of armed groups there. But you also talk about the minerals and the riches and the spoils of war being an attraction to this group. So how did Katanga province do it? It's Congo's mineral belt. They're rich in minerals and resources. How come there's peace in Katanga? Why can't they use the Katanga playbook to deal with the situation in the Eastern DRC?
That's a really good question. I mean, Katanga has always been an exception, right? It has been a kind of piece of Congo, which was always a bit different. First of all, because in colonial times, Katanga was the main kind of source of revenues for the whole colonial government. So all infrastructural efforts, all railway lines went from Katanga to the port, to different ports, in fact. And the colonial government really did its best to make sure that Katanga was stabilized, that the workforce in Katanga was policed, was being treated quite well. And so Katanga has a kind of special stature, and it has retained that special stature after independence as well. You may recall that when Congo announced its independence,
they wanted
Belgians
to secede.
Try to have Katanga secede and try to kind of keep control over Katanga, right? So Katanga is really the geopolitical linchpin in much of the story because it funded basically Mobutu's state coffer, by which he was able to then fund his patronage networks. And still today, the kind of revenues that come from the mining of copper and cobalt in Katanga are huge and constitute a big portion of government revenues. Okay. So in contrast to higher up portions of Eastern Congo where artisanal mining prevails, you will see that Katanga is really home to huge industrial concessions which are managed quite professionally, policed and secured by the army, just because there's so much at stake in the security of Katanga. So you could say, if you are a modernist development optimist, you could say that just turn the other provinces of the Kivu into industrial concessions again. And actually, many Congolese can still remember the time that in Ituri and in North Kivu and South Kivu, there were these large industrial mines, and they would build roads, they would provide housing, they would have health centers and schools for their staff. People still remember that. People who are now digging in artisanal mines, what they often say is, we want those companies back. Okay. These companies were started in the colonial times. They fared relatively well until the 70s, until they went bankrupt. But the problem is that today's global mining sector doesn't work in the same way anymore. It is not about building huge infrastructures, elevating the level of the people locally and employing locals and putting them into school and health centers. What they rather do is they work through outsourcing specific contracts to small companies to try and minimize labor costs that are associated to the kind of former modes of industrial production. So unfortunately for the provinces of South Kivu, North Kivu, and Ituri, it is very unlikely that industrial mining in the way that it is done today would lead to the same kind of development that has driven the development of Katanga, unless there's huge pressures by the government to make sure that companies really invest in local development. But that has unfortunately not been the case thus far.
Thank you, Per. We'll get to solutions in part 2, but before we go on a break, I would like to bring in Jordy here. Let's talk about the geopolitical play games, and there's quite a lot of distrust among the Great Lake nations. So many competing interests in the Eastern DRC. Just last week, we saw a detente in the relationship between Uganda and Rwanda following the visit of Kaguta Museveni's son to President Paul Kagame. The border was open. Do you think this could be the beginning of some type of peace within these Great Lake countries? And what's the current situation? What's the relationship like between Rwanda, Uganda, and Congo DRC when it comes to finding a lasting solutions to the problems in the Eastern DRC?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I believe that it was really important for Rwanda and Uganda to build that relationship and to have that relationship established again between the two countries. Rwanda has been lately isolated within the region. Just the fact that Uganda and Burundi in the south have closed their representations in Kigali, and Kagame has been sort of the bad player in the region. And then he had established a strong relationship with Felix Tshisekedi, which was to him a way to breathe. However, recently Tshisekedi has struck a deal with Uganda and have Ugandan troops in eastern DRC. That has frustrated Paul Kagame in some ways, and henceforth he re-established. And then, in some ways, it's sort of like a war game or psychological war game where Uganda needed to have his relationship established with Rwanda and then vice versa. And both of them has huge interest in maintaining insecurity in Eastern DRC, especially Rwanda, because Rwanda's stability has been based on the fact that they have been able to keep the FDLR in Congolese territory and wanting to have them disarmed completely. And then by having this relationship with Uganda and Rwanda, to me, it's a positive thing. However, this relationship kind of undermines the DRC's positions because during Kabila's regime, Kabila has been really had a strong stance over Rwanda, and with Uganda, the relationship has been more or less okay. But Felix tried to change that dynamic. However, it hasn't really been successful. He failed to capitalize on the fact that Rwanda had been isolated. By having these countries talking to each other, it's a positive thing. If they could have translate that into building a force that could end violence in Eastern Congo, I strongly believe that peace in Eastern Congo will benefit both Rwanda and Uganda. But at the moment, instability benefits Rwanda and Uganda. But for a long-lasting peace and stability and economical growth, it's important that the three countries work in building a strong stability in the region. By keeping DRC the way it is at the moment, there's about thousands and thousands of people displaced between borders, between Uganda and DRC and Rwanda and Uganda and Burundi, more or less. And then population has been moved across borders. Burundians have been fleeing to DRC, Congolese have been fleeing to Burundi, Rwandan have been fleeing to DRC, and vice versa. And in the long term, this does not benefit economically the region. It's really important, I believe, that this government speak truly. What Felix tried to do, he sort of like tried to work on that. However, agendas in the minds of Rwanda and Uganda are still not the same. They are
the thoughts aren't aligned. Everyone is not quite on the same page yet. Thank you, Jordy. We'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, I believe we've established what the situation in the Eastern DRC is. We'll try to prefer solutions to some of these problems we've analyzed. Do stay with us. You're watching Secure the Continent at News Central Television. welcome back. If you're just joining us, we're discussing the security situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, we've been discussing security in the Eastern DRC, and I still have my guests here with me, Jordy Umbalo and Peer Shouten with me. Now, Pierre, you were in the Eastern DRC as early as November last year. How dire is the situation in the Eastern DRC right now, and what are some of the effects of this ongoing conflict on the ordinary people in the Congo?
Thanks. I mean, Eastern Congo is predominantly rural, so many people depend on subsistence farming for their livelihoods. And you have to imagine how farmers get taxed at every turn by soldiers and rebels. As I mentioned before, I've mapped over 800 roadblocks in just 2 provinces. So to enter their fields, farmers get taxed. When they leave their fields with their harvests, they get taxed again. To enter their village or a village market, there's another a checkpoint where they get taxed. On the road to town, there's even more taxes. So all these taxes on everything, they drive up prices, of course, making Congolese products less competitive than imported Rwandese foodstuff, which isn't taxed so much. And then there's the insecurity. I mean, having fled once or twice because your village has been under attack, many farmers have abandoned labor-intense crops like beans in favor of war foods like manioc or cassava, if you will, which has a lot lower nutrients. And then finally, since about 5 years, a new fashion has emerged among bandits, but also among rebels and soldiers, and this is kidnapping. And it is a very widespread practice affecting school-going children, tourists, and urban populations in the East. So this is really the kind of basic context that people live with every day in Eastern Congo.
Now, thank you very much, Pierre. Jody, the 23-year-old United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission, MONUSCO, in the DRC has been charged with monitoring the peace deals that ended the 1998 to 2003 war. With an annual budget of $1.4 billion and some 19,000 troops, MONUSCO is the largest UN peacekeeping mission in the world. Why is the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the United Nations MONUSCO, struggling to keep the peace? I mean, there seems to be no peace in sight after 23 years. Why is this?
Well, the MONUSCO has a limited operational abilities to operate. And then their mandate is only to protect the population and nothing more than that. However, in 2012, the MONUSCO has organized another army alliance between Tanzania, DRC, to put an end to M23 back in the days. And this was limited in time and have been really successful. However, the mandate that has been established since the year 2000, have had the MONUSCO limited operationally, and they've more or less been there to just observe and monitor the security. This had frustrated the population on the ground by the fact that in most cases the MONUSCO have been there in Beni, for example, where ADF had attacked villages and committed crimes. And MONUSCO have only came to report and established the number of people killed and number of people injured and displaced. And the government has struggled at the same time to build a cooperation with MONUSCO in some operations. MONUSCO have been accusing the government to be able to put in place reforms within the army. And the MONUSCO had told the army I believe in 2012, 2013, that they can only cooperate with the army if the army was able to extract officers that have been accused by the UN for committing crime or for maintaining militias in North Kivu. And since that report had been published during Kabila's regime, up to today, the new regime had failed to follow up with that report. And henceforth, the MONUSCO still in that kind of status quo. And the army, on the other hand, has also failed to put some strong reforms to reorganize the army, to reorganize its forces and be more effective. There was no need to have 21,000 troops deployed. There was a need to just reform the army, to move the army, because the troops deployed in Eastern Congo at the moment have been deployed there for over 10 years. And like I said before, they've been a fatigue, and then they've been the troops are demoralized because salary not following, ammunition is not following, and then their officers have been accused of cooperating with militias, with the ADF, and also owning, exploiting resources. And this had allowed the army to focus less on their duty and just be there and see
and act like one of those armed groups in the DRC. Thank you, Jordy. I would like to take up Pierre's response to this. I mean, we've established the fact that the Congolese army is not one of the most professional armies in the world. Do you think, and if I was MONUSCO, if I was the United Nations International Development Partners, I will be very frustrated with the government of the Congo. So regardless of who's in charge in Kinshasa, if it's Joseph Kabila, if it's Félix Tshisekedi, not much has changed in terms of the professionalism of the Congolese army, the FARDC. Do you think the United Nations should change the rules of engagement of MONUSCO? Will this act as a possible solution? Because all they do is just sit back and watch things go south, and so much resources in terms of human and material have been put into this effort. 23 years now, and not a lot has changed.
Yes, I think it's a very legitimate question. If you consider particularly that this budget of 1.4 billion US dollars each year is a lot of money, particularly in the eyes of Congolese who perhaps survive on average on $1 a day. So I think it's a really legitimate question to ask: what is this money being spent on, and what does it lead to? I have myself very mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I think that this whole mission and all the expats and NGOs attached to it, even if they might not be so efficient in terms of delivering what they have as their own objectives, they do put money into the society in a way. So there is a way in which all these NGOs and the UN start a lot of development programs, try to build roads, try to engage in services for the population. And even if it's through corruption or through outsourcing or through indeed rebel taxation, a big portion of this money, Congolese are creative, finds its way into communities. So in that way, I think it's an important mechanism of putting money into communities. And I think that we should not give up the idea that it is important to try and engage and try and reinvent itself. Of course, the UN is a conservative machinery. These missions are there to represent the great powers or consensus among the great powers. So it's not likely that any UN mission will be very innovative in what it will try out to obtain some kind of development here.
Thanks, Pierre. Jordy, the Congo has been through quite a lot since the time of King Leopold II. It's almost always in a state of conflict. Are there any efforts being made to negotiate with some of those armed groups in the DRC? Because ordinary Congolese are really, really tired of the violence that is going on there. And are these groups averse to dialogue? What happened in the past when they try to sit down to find a solution? Because I don't think you can shoot your way out of a conflict.
Yeah, well, there have been a lot of negotiations between the government organizing what's called table ronde, where militias, the government, and local NGOs and local community leaders had met to to talk about peace. This has been successful after the Hema and the Lendu clashes between 1998 and 2003. However, that cycle of violence, there've been a lack of maintaining that engagement and dialogue between the two communities. And also, like Peer says, the army had played a big role in maintaining and maintaining these conflicts, low-key conflicts, I would say. The government as well has been, I believe, the biggest agent responsible in not following up the processes. Following most of these dialogues, especially there've been the DDR, where demobilized Congolese from militias have been reestablished in the communities. The government had failed to follow up by, for example, giving these people some senses of purpose, for example. And then once they're back in the communities, they get back into struggling and economically to feed their families. The only way to survive is to move back, to go back into militias where they can make money. So the government has been at this point the biggest has failed completely to sort of like maintain the dynamic in that region.
Thank you very much, Jordy. Now, just before we begin to wrap things up, I'd like to ask you this question, Peer. Is this situation winnable? You've been on the ground, you've talked to people, you've done extensive research on the DRC. Are we looking at another Afghan-type situation where you have warlords and pockets of armed groups in every corner of the region? Is there, what would you propose can lead to sustainable peace in the Eastern DRC?
Thanks. I mean, this is the million-dollar question, of course. So, I'm not sure if I have it, but I'm willing to give it a go. And I think that one really important thing here, a crucial thing, in fact, is dialogues between communities and resolving local level land issues. Land issues are often at the heart of conflicts in Eastern Congo. And if you don't get these kind of local grievances right, then it's going to be difficult to reach higher level kinds of solutions to conflict. I mean, negotiations, as we said, I think I'm not so pessimistic about them. It's widespread, and a major victory was last year when Guidon, who himself led a big armed group called NDC, surrendered himself. I mean, most rebels just want a nice package of TDR, reintegration, and integrate in the army and leave the bush. In the past, the Congolese state struck many deals like that, integrating armed groups into the army.
And we've also, sorry to interrupt, we've also seen, was it Bosco Ngatanga that surrendered and is relaxed in The Hague right now?
Right. So there's many examples in the past where things do work, but these are very highly political solutions, right? There's a broker at the highest level. But the problem is that if you offer armed groups an incentive to be integrated into the army, then it actually becomes an incentive for armed mobilization and violence. And militia have actually also mushroomed in the past because and simple soldiers would call themselves general in the hope of negotiating a good post in the army. In fact, often violence is simply part of political negotiation strategies. And many militia are also proxies for or sustained by the Congolese army. So in that way, the connection between the state and rebels is a bit too close already.
Quite a dire situation there. Jordy, finally, before we leave, what's your solution to lasting peace in the DRC and Eastern DRC? And do you think it's possible in the nearest future? Because the situation we painted all through this program today is not pretty at all. It's quite complex.
Yeah, I believe there's a solution. There's a way to end the cycle of violence. First of all, to me, I believe that DRC has to have an elected, legitimate government in place that would put in place policies that would benefit the people, and also that reform the army itself, because the army so far has been labeled as one of the key agent in fueling this violence on the ground. Once an elected, legitimate government can have the power to enforce laws and policies, there've been a lot of reform that have been established in parliament, in negotiations, but the government had failed to put that into practice. And Felix Tshisekedi has a weakness as a president, just by the fact that the way he was elected. And I don't believe that he will be the person who can be able to do that. So I believe that an elected government will have the mandate and the real power and will to really enforce these reforms and put in place that can build a strong and long-lasting peace in the region.
Thank you, Jordy. I would like to say a very big thank you to you. Peer Shouten, a senior researcher at the Danish International Institute of, I think I need to check that, Danish Institute for International Studies and expert on the conflict in Congo. Join us live from Copenhagen, Denmark, and Jordy Umbalo live from Melbourne, Australia. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I did enjoy your insights on the subject matter.
Thank you. Thanks, my pleasure.
Speaking to community dwellers, knowing their problems and solving them will help security in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Also, sincerity of purpose of foreign interventions have to be streamlined to solving the security upheavals and not reaping the country of its resources. A holistic approach to solving the security challenges must be adopted in every country. Thanks for watching Secure the Continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa. Until next time.